Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining me, as always, is Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, this week from Singapore. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, 2 data points for you this week, but first, quick update on our live shows. I've mentioned these before. The one in New York is already sold out, but there are still virtual tickets available for that one. Check those out online at Caveat. The link's in our show notes. The DC show, there are still some tickets available, but you might want to check them out soon. As I mentioned, the other show's already sold out. If you're thinking about getting them, check it out. Link is also in our show notes. VIP tickets and virtual tickets, I think, for that show are also both available. So check it out. As I mentioned, 2 data points this week. The second is on Michigan. It's the second in our intermittent series on swing states in the U.S. presidential election. Stick around for that. But first, a data point that is 98%, which is how much the Lebanese pound has lost in its value between 2019 and December 2023. 98%. Obviously, Lebanon has been in the news very recently with, that country and Israel at the precipice of war.
Rocket fire lights up the sky over Galilee in northern Israel, the result of strikes launched by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon.
In the largest cross-border attacks against each other since the start of the war in Gaza. Overnight, Israel firing first, launching what it called a preemptive strike against Hezbollah.
Leaders say the attack is in retaliation for one of the deaths of one of its commanders. Israel confirms it launched.
Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia, has been exchanging fire with Israel since the start of fighting in Gaza. Israel has repeatedly suggested that an expansion of that fighting on its northern border could happen at any time, but until now, at least, predictions of a full escalation have been false alarms. What has not been a false alarm, however, has been the free fall of Lebanon's economy in recent years. A financial crisis that started about 5 years ago has plunged the country, which had previously been one of the region's more wealthy, into utter poverty. And for all the military dangers that Lebanon now faces, its economic troubles could be its gravest threat. So we thought we'd try to unpack some of that. Adam, I wanted to start with this kind of these years of crisis in Lebanon. I'm curious, how severe is the collapse of Lebanon's economy that began around 2019? And what state of development was the country in before that point? What level is it at now? And are there precedents for that degree of economic decline?
Yeah, I'm really glad we're talking about this because with all of the diplomatic rowing and the risk of war, which may, hopefully, fingers crossed, remain hypothetical, there really is, as you were saying, Cam, a tendency to overlook the actual disaster which has befallen the millions of people that live in Lebanon. And I was very moved by this and did a newsletter about it this week. It's a truly dramatic story. I mean, the World Bank says it's the most severe, one of the most severe crisis episodes globally since the mid-19th century, which essentially means in modern economic history. The collapse began, as you were saying, in the fall of 2019. It was financial and monetary. The currency collapsed. I mean, you cited the figure of 98%. I mean, that some sense it understates the collapse because essentially the Lebanese economy has become dollarized as far as possible. So the currency has stopped really functioning for most activities. That was on the back of massive local inflation. The banking system imploded in 2020. The banks remained shut for years. Lebanese resorted to their armories of small arms to actually fight their way into banks, to extract their own money, not to steal or rob, but literally just to gain access to their bank accounts. The Lebanese government, in an act of real fecklessness, engaged in a hard default. So it didn't announce to its creditors that it was going to be unable to pay, and the attempt to negotiate it just stopped payment, which is very unusual as a mode of default. The net effect of this on GDP is not easy to measure. But the sort of fanciest measure of GDP, which is purchasing power parity adjusted GDP, which allows for the cost of living and so on, the World Bank estimate says that at the beginning of the crisis at $22,000 per head per year. Lebanon's GDP per capita was well above the world average, perhaps 20% above. And that in itself may be an underestimate. What is clear is that today, Lebanon's GDP per capita is probably closer to half the world average at 12K. And that doesn't account for the huge inequality in the country, which has left a very large slice of the population in dire poverty, and doesn't account really either for the fact that basics like water and electricity are incredibly hard to get hold of unless you're earning dollars and can pay hard cash. You end up relying on local militia and local political parties and businesses that are well connected politically for the essentials. The power supply has essentially failed. And all of this is on top of the fact that Lebanon is sheltering millions of refugees from Syria. We don't exactly know how many because the Lebanese government, in its wisdom, decided it was no longer politically opportune to count them. But it's definitely millions. Lebanon probably, along with Turkey, shelters most of the Syrian refugees. And they, of course, on the run from a country which since 2011 imploded into an ultra-violent civil war and whose economy has collapsed even more than Lebanon's. So Lebanon and Syria, which used to form an affluent, urbanized, they're the classic hub of the Arab civilization and economy in the Mediterranean. Syria's economy is probably imploded by 80% or more. So the two together form a zone of disaster, the scale of which is hard to exaggerate.
You mentioned having written about this in your Substack newsletter, and it's a really compelling discussion of Lebanon's problems. You mentioned that the economic problems that are coming to a head here, obviously very stark. You say perhaps one of the worst economic crises in modern history. You say that these problems trace their roots to the civil war in Lebanon of the 1970s and 1980s and the sectarian political system that was created after that war. I'm curious, what is the relationship there? I mean, what was that sectarian system that was created, and what role exactly is that playing in these problems that the country is facing?
Well, Lebanon previously had a Maronite Christian-dominated political system going back to the Mandate period when it was under French influence. And in the civil war between the mid-70s and November 1989, after years of bloody and ruinous fighting, a settlement was reached, the so-called Taif Agreement. I hope that's the right pronunciation. It's a Saudi town. And in the Taif Agreement, signed in November 1989, Lebanon's political structure was basically reorganized to recognize the significance of the different religious groups, Druze, Christian, Sunni, Shia, all of whom were given effectively voice and representation within the Lebanese political system under the supervision, one might say, or patronage essentially of Syria. And this was a recipe for peace. Many democracies are based on these kind of hard-won, brutal compromises between different groups. But it's not a recipe for dynamic progress or governmental reform. Having said that, the 90s and the early 2000s were a relatively good period for Lebanon from the point of view of economic development under Rafik Hariri, the prime minister of the time, who was a Lebanese businessman. Lebanon, a little bit like Israel, embarks on a kind of pro-business, pro-market reform period. And that, however, comes to a bloody end in 2005 with his assassination, then with the war between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006, and then with the collapse of the Syrian regime after 2011, which, brutal as it was, had provided a kind of anchor of stability for the power balance in Lebanon, and that all comes unstuck in the 2010s. And Lebanon from that point onwards sort of slides towards progressive paralysis, which shows up in the inability to maintain power or water supply, to maintain garbage collection, which then spills over, first of all, into a major shift in the 2018 elections, and then following that, a series of mass protests against the government, which was widely thought to have been under Hezbollah's influence. So we're talking about a society which is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, that went through this brutal phase of civil war, that resolved the civil war in the form of a political system which then incorporated a wider range of groups. Initially, that then, through the 2000s, ushered in a period of market-based, business-driven, you could call it kind of neoliberalism, if you like, though it's some people referred to Lebanon at the time as a strange mixture of Hanoi and Hong Kong. And all of that coming to a kind of violent end in the period, which sees an escalation of violence, after all, not just in Lebanon, but also in relations between Palestine and Israel, notably in Gaza in the Lebanese case from 2006 onwards. And all of that, of course, is in a highly unpropitious backdrop for the development of the Lebanese economy, whose weakness is finally cracked, if you like, after 2019.
So it seems like Hezbollah, which is at the center of all these issues now, it seems like that became a critical pillar of the country's economy beginning in that post-Civil War period, and that's extended to the present day, although in a way that pillar is kind of siloed off. It's a separate pillar from much of the rest of the Lebanese economy. I'm curious, has Hezbollah been more responsible, so to speak, as economic managers of their siloed economy than the country's broader financial and political elite who have overseen this kind of unprecedented economic collapse?
I think I want to tread carefully here because I got some interesting reactions to the newsletter saying that because I'd focused the newsletter on Hezbollah because of the confrontation with Israel, that I was exaggerating the singularity of the Hezbollah political economy, and that in fact it had to be seen as part of an ecosystem with powerful Christian militia or ex-militia, powerful Christian interests. And that makes perfect sense. And when we come on to talking about Hezbollah's banking system, I think that comes out very clearly. The impression one gets is not so much of Hezbollah as being a kind of more prudent manager, but just having rather different interests. And Hezbollah effectively defines itself as a resistance group. Under the Taif Agreement of 1989, Hezbollah was granted the special status as a resistance group because it was allowed to maintain its Civil War era militia with full armaments, unlike the other militia groups, including Fatah, the PLO, Christian militia. They were all required to hand in their heavy weapons, and Hezbollah wasn't. And from the early 2000s onwards, as relations with Israel escalate, Second Intifada, the American invasion of Iraq, and then the crunching confrontations between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah's distinctive emphasis on struggle as the sort of core of its vision becomes more and more particular in Lebanon. There's a rumor that they were involved in the assassination of Hariri because he was not aligned with their more war economic vision of where Lebanon needs to head. And in a series of brutal confrontations in Beirut in 2008, Hezbollah clashed with the other interests in Lebanon. So I think the distinctive thing about Hezbollah is not so much that somehow they're a tighter run ship or more fiscally prudent in any way, but they are part of this standoff of interest groups in Lebanon that have collectively contributed to the collapse of recent years. And of all of the contending forces, they're the one that is most interested in escalating tension with Israel, which enormously increases the pressure on Lebanon. And so that really is Hezbollah's distinctive role. And Hezbollah will, of course, claim the mantle of legitimacy through its confrontation with Israel, and its self-declared victory over Israel in 2006 adds to its legitimacy in the eyes of those who want to force the resistance against Israel. But from an economic point of view, as you were saying, it's really more a story, I think, of a relatively balkanized economy, with Hezbollah having carved out its own niche that runs very much according to the dictates of its resistance strategy, but cooperates on a ad hoc and pragmatic basis with other components of the Lebanese power system when it suits their interests.
Yeah, so let's take, I guess, a look at an example of this in the form of Hezbollah's banks, which are not connected to other Lebanese banks, which are themselves part of the global financial system. Hezbollah's banks stand apart from that. And I'm curious, have they suffered for not being connected in that way? Obviously, Lebanon's other banks are not doing well. How are Hezbollah's banks doing in comparison?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a story, this. I mean, I ended up calling them shadow banks because the distinctive thing about Hezbollah's financial operations is that they do not register as banks with the Lebanese authorities. Hezbollah's financial arm, AQAH is the acronym, has been under sanctions from the Americans since 2007. So it's not an actor that anyone in the legitimate dollar-based financial system in the world wants to engage with. But in Lebanon itself, it plays a critical role. And this is where really the cooperation with the other interests in Lebanon is quite marked, because Hezbollah runs the exchange houses. Other interests in Lebanon who have a less antagonistic relationship with global financial regulators put the front end, if you like, of official banking. But Hezbollah runs the exchange houses, and it has an extensive network of contacts, of course, in the massive Shia interest in Iraq and in Iran, through which it has access to dollars. It has an extensive gold smuggling operation. And it has powerful backers in the Arab League who are willing to place their financial institutions at its disposal for long-range dollar system relevant transactions that it wants to conduct. So Hezbollah's financial system has thrived. It has over the years made billions of dollars of loans. If you're a small business operator, not just Shia in Lebanon right now, in many parts of the country, AQAH is where you go to get cash loans. You do them against deposits of securities in the form notably of gold, which then provides the AQAH system with a float on the basis of which it can actually then issue new credits. So it's functioning like a bank, but as it were outside the bank system. And then with the implosion of the mainstream banking system in Lebanon since 2020, they've really become a key provider of day-to-day liquidity and cash, and they've set up ATMs, issuing unusually generous quantities of cash and dollars to people who need access to those. So both through its global network, through its acknowledged position within the ecosystem of the Lebanese financial sector, and then through the shocks of what's happened since 2020, the Hezbollah financial operation has moved over to the fore. And this is an interesting development because Hezbollah was always famous. It's world famous for the way in which it's built its grip on Shia society in Lebanon through its welfare provision. Islamic welfare is a well-established tradition. You see it also in the Islamic Brotherhood movement, but the Hezbollah was very powerful in developing both medical services and welfare provision. But this financial arm is really a rapidly expanding and novel component, and it digs Hezbollah ever more profoundly into Lebanon's fabric. I mean, one paper I read was really interesting because, if you're short of electricity and your power supply is breaking down, what do you want? Well, what you want is solar power and batteries now, right? Because of the green energy revolution. And guess who will supply you with cheap Chinese solar panels, converters and batteries and the credit to go with it? AQAH. So, they really are building a kind of one-stop financial and energy supply business.
I did want to ask about the regional influence in Lebanon's economy. I mean, Iran is obviously a major player as Hezbollah's main backer. Can Iran afford the assistance it's giving to Hezbollah in Lebanon? And does it get a good deal from that assistance it's giving? And then the other kind of big regional player, I'm curious about the role it has in Lebanon's economy, is Israel itself. Does Israel get involved in Lebanon's economy in any substantial way? And are they involved now in this crisis?
I mean, great questions. I mean, Iran's GDP is, estimated at over $400 billion, and it pays Hezbollah a couple of $100 billion a year. So yes, the answer is Iran can afford the support it gives to Hezbollah. And it buys it, after all, an awful lot of attention and threat potential against Israel at a relatively modest cost. So I think the answer there is yes, it can afford it, and probably it's getting good value. I searched hard for evidence of like Israeli-Lebanon connections, because after all, the Israeli economy is tightly linked, say, to the West Bank economy and to the other economies of the region. And I mean, the trade data just say it's derisory, a few tens of thousands of dollars either way. I mean, in terms of trade, couldn't find much discussion of business interests or foreign direct investment. The one thing that has happened on the economic side between Israel and Lebanon is an agreement after many years of acrimonious bargaining and some threats by, drones and whatever, over the large gas fields which have been discovered off the coast of both Lebanon and Israel. Israel has a discrete field, and then there is one which is overwhelmingly in Lebanon, but has one partial part which is in the Israeli zone of interest. And there was a US brokered deal in 2022 that was supposed to open the way for the development of the both the Lebanese and the Israeli side. The Israelis were always free really to do theirs anyway, but this was supposed to, as it were, create a ceasefire. How far that still holds is an open question, I think. But that seems to be the major interest. The lack of anything more substantial between what really should be sort of twin hubs of the Eastern Mediterranean economy is a sign of just how messed up everything is.
It's pretty shocking, yeah. I mean, tens of thousands of dollars of trade between.
I know, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
And that's the official trade. But I mean, effectively, southern Lebanon is, is a militarized zone, isn't it? So it doesn't. Maybe a listener can correct us on this, but those were the numbers I was able to find.
Well, we're always available by email if anyone has numbers. But we should take a break here for now. We will be back in a second to talk about the American state of Michigan. Hi, and welcome back. Our next data point is $304 billion. That is the amount of money that the auto industry contributes to Michigan's economy every year. Michigan is synonymous in some ways with the U.S. auto industry. 21% of all U.S. auto production occurred in Michigan in 2022. 98 of the top 100 auto suppliers have a presence in Michigan. I mentioned a few weeks ago we wanted to do a series on U.S. swing states. Michigan is number 2 on our list. To dive right in, Adam, this status is the home of the U.S. auto industry. Why is the first question I have. Why Michigan? I mean, why is the industry concentrated in one place, and in this place specifically? As we both know, Germany's car makers are kind of spread out regionally. There's some in Bavaria, some in the Southwest, some more in the North. So, yeah, how did this happen in the U.S. this way?
Yeah, we shouldn't take the German model as typical, I think. I mean, Germany wasn't really a big maker of cars, though they invented the car until later in the 20th century. And if you look at other big car manufacturing hubs like the UK, that's very heavily concentrated in the Midlands too. So this American pattern is not really that unusual for industrial. This is the phenomenon known to industrial economists as industrial clustering. And it has a logic that is basically built on supply chains, right? You build a cluster of industries that all serve a common supply chain, and then you build specialist workforces and skill sets, and you get innovation in those networks. And Michigan was one of the places where that was happening in any case in a variety of different industries. It's a pretty typical Midwestern economy of the late 19th century. It's based on things like lumber initially, enabled by the railroads, which come from the 1850s onwards. And early on, you get concentrations of industrial sectors. So Grand Rapids in particular becomes an absolutely key hub for furniture making. It's one of the leading furniture manufacturers for all of the US. The car industry began to concentrate in Detroit, traditionally a French area of settlement, which is also where you get, folks like Chevrolet from Switzerland and Burgundy, settling in the region and giving their names to American car brands. And by the 1890s, the early car industry is beginning to settle. Folks like R.E. Olds from Oldsmobile, who's known as the schoolmaster of Detroit's car industry, settles there. It's got everything you would need. It's got water for power. It's got heavy industry. It's got steel within easy reach. It's got great railway connections for long distance shipping. And the industry aggregates in a fairly typical pattern. Then, of course, you get the settlement of Ford, Dodge, General Motors, all expand their production. And it's not just in Detroit itself, but in Michigan and then across the Midwest and then across the border also into Canada, which becomes part of a sort of early version of the North American auto production system that continues all the way down to the present day now, including Mexico. So this is a fairly typical pattern of industrial development and car industry development worldwide. It's pretty typical of the US for industries in general, and it's heavily path dependent. It's exactly one of those stories which doesn't really have, it has general enabling structural factors, but then once they begin to aggregate, They acquire a logic of their own, which then concentrates the industry there. And it's really the big boom of Ford initially, then the development of mass production on a broader base, with GM in particular picking up the baton. And then World War II, which concentrates a very wide range of military industrial production around Detroit and the Canadian border. So a lot of the big aluminium projects, for instance, which are crucial to feeding the aerospace industry, which Detroit also gets in on, are on the Canadian side of the border. So you get this North American production complex, heavy industrial production complex. That's really what consolidates the grip of the Detroit producers. As we've discussed in other episodes, it begins to disperse and disaggregate from the 1950s and 60s onwards. And nowadays, there is still the big three so-called American producers for GM, Chrysler, but they're only one part of what is now a very dispersed automotive production network, which includes many non-American firms operating outside that traditional hub.
Yeah, as a result of this, Detroit itself is now kind of the paradigm of this concept of a shrinking city. The statistics here are pretty stark. I think the city has lost some 60% of its population in the last 60 years. I'm curious what Detroit shows about that process. I mean, is being a shrinking city, is that a manageable phenomenon? What can we say about that on Detroit's experience?
Yeah, I think manageable is a bit of a stretch. I mean, that kind of presents it in a rather more, shall we say, gentle process than it's actually been. I mean, it's one of the great catastrophes of urban life in the United States, not just in the United States, but in the West, you could say. Detroit grows from a really small town in the 19th century to a city of a couple of 100,000 to a metropolis by 1950 of almost 1.85 million. At that point, it was also, I think, the richest metro area in the United States because of the concentrated wealth of the industry. And as you were saying, yes, by 2015, it's down to a population of 680,000. It has a poverty rate of 40% at that point. And characteristically and indicatively and tellingly for a big American city, the racial balance has completely tipped. So the black population of Michigan is overwhelmingly a product of the Great Migration of the early 20th century out of the Jim Crow South, sucked by jobs in World War I and then World War II. It provokes a lot of very vicious anti-black racism. There's a huge amount of discrimination, housing segregation. Ford, in particular, was a notoriously racist employer. And so the black-white balance in 1950 was 83% white, 16% black in Detroit. By 2010, this is completely inverted. So as the city loses its population and as poverty rises and as deindustrialization sets in, and then the ruination of the city, the black share of the population rises to 82%. And then in 2013, to culminate this disaster, Detroit files the largest municipal bankruptcy in the US. And the consequence of that is that basic services are basically shut down. Even the police department is run at a bare minimum. Detroit's idea of urban planning in the 2010s is basically large-scale bulldozing of unoccupied, attractive. Eminem is the great bard of the Detroit rap scene, and his videos and their iconography gives one, I think, a stark sense of what Detroit had come to stand for by 2010. I mean, visiting the art museum there with its spectacular Diego de Rivera murals was a really eerie experience of sort of urban, tourism, as kind of wasteland porn, really, traveling through the town. Detroit has come back. It's stabilized. Population has, I think, rebounded somewhat in economic terms. The poverty rate has come down. There is a process through which urban environments in the US churn in this brutal way from boom to bust to quote unquote recovery as new industries, the service sector, the staples of urban life in the US, which are education and health, and then an artistic scene, repopulate the inner city. But by any other country's standards, Detroit would be seen as the site of urban disaster, to be honest. And this is compounded, of course, as in places like Newark, by the ferocity of racial politics in the US in the 60s. We shouldn't talk about this without talking about the rioting and its impact on the city, and white flight, which accelerates so dramatically from the late 60s onwards. So really, one shouldn't paint a picture of this process as smooth or manageable. It's a story of crisis, essentially, of an extraordinary scale.
To mention another town in Michigan, though, I wanted to ask about Ann Arbor, which is the home of the University of Michigan, and to that extent, a quintessential liberal college town in the United States. The college town model I'm curious about as a kind of economy of its own, and I'm curious whether that's sustainable to have a university anchor a local economy. Are there specific problems that arise as a result of that model?
Yeah, I mean, I love Ann Arbor. I have very fond memories. My first wife was a grad student there when we were getting together, so I've spent a lot of happy time there. To call it a college town perhaps undersells University of Michigan somewhat, right? Because we're not, one's idea of a college town is, I don't know, a place like Dartmouth or something like that, right? Which is a sort of, large boarding school in a really true small town. University of Michigan is a global powerhouse university with tens of thousands of students. It ranks in the top 20 in the world of universities. It's a much bigger university than a place like Yale, for instance, in New Haven, Connecticut. It's a really old university. It was founded in 1817. It was modeled by the ambitious local bourgeoisie on the University of Paris, a model that Napoleon had created, a kind of open form of modern higher education. University of Michigan has the first dedicated chemistry lab in the United States, is the second institution in the US to issue science degrees, and in 1900 is running neck and neck with Harvard as the two largest universities in the United States. So this is not a college. It's not a college. It's a university. It's a giant research university. And it's only one of three big universities that make a very major impact on the Michigan economy. So the other two are Michigan State. If you know your American sports, you'll know that there's a huge rivalry between University of Michigan and Michigan State. And usually they're both state schools, right? This isn't a private public, contrast like Berkeley versus Stanford. So these are two state schools. University of Michigan is the one that attracts more out-of-state students. It's the one with the global reputation. Michigan State is the scrappier university. And then there's Wayne State. And the three of them together have a huge footprint in the Michigan economy. A minimum of $24 billion is pumped into the local economy, hundreds of thousands of jobs that feed off this, real estate to house the students and maintain the staff. It's a major footprint. And it seems weird almost to quibble about this. So like, why is this not great? And broadly speaking, as I'm trying to convey, it's remarkable. Like, folks outside the US don't appreciate the scale and force of the great state universities in the US, Ohio State, Michigan, Berkeley in the California system, because we think of the fancy private schools, but the backbone of the US, the top US university system are the great public schools, and Michigan is really a standout example of that. There is, however, a school of thought which says that we need to monitor the key institutions which maintain urban life in the US. And there's this very interesting set of reports out of the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia, which looks at the combined footprint of universities and hospitals in the urban economies of the United States. And for a Detroit or a New Haven, Connecticut, which are blitzed post-industrial towns, both of them, the way in which the college and university hospital complex dominates their local economies can, I think, really be seen as a sign of ill health. Because what that's basically saying is they don't have diversified large-scale private sectors which are sustaining large-scale employment in other areas. There are versions of this, right? So the Connecticut case, the New Haven case, is particularly extreme because New Haven is really a major loser in the deindustrialization race, and Yale is such a spectacularly rich college. Where this is really worrying is not only where the situation is that the hospital and the university are maintaining employment in a declining industrial town, but the worst situation is the one where the university is declining too. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to University of Michigan, which has got hugely oversubscribed, or let alone to Yale. But there are many smaller American colleges, which really are college town colleges with a couple of thousand students and a budget of a couple of $100 million a year in a town with virtually no other businesses, where the structural decline in the number of undergraduates in American education, simply as demographic change kicks in, is really a menace to the future of what's left of urban life or small town life. Michigan and Ann Arbor are a very, very long way removed from that. Something truly catastrophic would have to happen to challenge the viability of one of the top 20 universities in the world. It's not happening anytime soon. But across the broad swath of American society and small town life in particular, the declining college town, a little bit like the declining shopping mall, it's a hard process to reverse because it's difficult. It's easy to ride an upswing with big, powerful institutions acting as anchors. It's a lot harder when your anchor becomes unstuck, as is happening in some of the weaker colleges.
So I want to shift to another industry that is associated with Michigan, specifically a certain town in Michigan, that is Battle Creek. Listeners may not know that, but it is the home at one time of both Kellogg and Post, which are the two major manufacturers of breakfast cereals in the United States. As a result, Battle Creek sort of became the center of this breakfast cereal industry. Curious, what is the backstory? How did that become established? And what is the state of the breakfast cereal industry now? How has it expanded from Battle Creek, Michigan?
Yeah, it's a truly fascinating story of American culture and American life in the 19th century. Because breakfast, now there is, of course, everyone's mum tells them breakfast is the most important meal of the day and so on and so forth. That's actually an invention of health science in the 19th century, if one can call it that. And it's a kind of mid-19th century phenomenon. You get the first sort of healthy eating experimentation in the 1860s. There's a guy in New York who ran a sanatorium and then came up with a kind of cereal type concept, which he called granola. And then you can see where this is going. A group of health nuts in Michigan who were Seventh-day Adventists and were running a sanatorium started making something that was suspiciously like the granola that had been pioneered by the health freaks in New York. And when they threatened to sue, they changed their version to granola, which is how many Americans know, the American sort of hyped up muesli product, which is very popular today. Those brothers, who were proteges of the Seventh-day Adventist community in Battle Creek, ran a very, for a while, famous sanatorium and worked assiduously at making healthy breakfast foods. And they spawned the Post empire as well, because he was one of their staff members. And in the course of their experimentation in the 1890s, a combination of bizarre baking experiments where they left things to get stale and then put them back in the oven. And out of this eventually emerged something that was the forerunner of the Kellogg's cornflake. But the crucial thing was, in the course of the 90s, that they had to discover that corn was really the ideal combination. And that's what gives birth then in 1902 to what the world comes to know as cornflakes. And so it's this combination of entrepreneurship, hucksterism, Seventh-day Adventism, and sanatoria, and a concerted effort to promote breakfast as a special meal that gives rise to this American phenomenon of breakfast cereal as we know it in the 20th century. And it was originally, it was very much centered in Battle Creek through to the middle of the 20th century. It can truly claim to be the home of breakfast cereal worldwide.
Now it's clearly a global industry. Obviously, you can walk into the supermarket here in Germany and buy cornflakes or any other cereal, which didn't exist a little more than 100 years ago. So thanks to Michigan for that. Finally, though, I wanted to ask about one more town, and that is Dearborn, which is America's first Arab majority city. I'm curious about the economy of Dearborn and how that relates to the fear-mongering that is very common about Muslim migration by far-right populists. That's obviously very common in Europe as well. Does Dearborn offer any insights about that?
Not really, other than to calm down and be reasonable. I mean, it's classic story of American migration shot through with racial and religious dynamics that we're familiar with. I mean, and it links to the story about Lebanon and Syria, because the Arab migrants to the Midwest from the late 19th century onwards tended to come from what would become, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the separate states of Syria and Lebanon. They were often originally Christian Lebanese, so Maronites, but then as the century drew to an end, the late 19th century and into the 20th century, they were increasingly Muslim. And in part, they settle in Dearborn and Detroit to the extent that they do because Henry Ford was establishing in Dearborn in River Rouge his giant, really industry-defining new factory. And Ford was a notorious anti-black racist and anti-Semite. And so he was quite happy to employ large numbers of Arabic-speaking Muslim workers who make up a very large share of the Dearborn workforce by the 1920s already. Then, of course, the migration restrictions kick in hard in the US and restrict migration of all types. The Arab community in Dearborn flourishes along with the American motor vehicle industry. They survive various misguided efforts by the city elders to destroy their neighborhoods by urban redevelopment. And then in time for the American migration liberalization of the 1960s, they're ready to welcome a new wave of migrants from Lebanon as the civil war breaks out there, and from Yemen as the Cold War, eats up large parts of the more unstable Arab world. And so the Arab population and the Muslim population of Dearborn continues to rise, and it then becomes the first city to elect an Arab mayor, a very liberal figure, and is the bastion of the pro-Palestinian Democratic Party left in the current moment. Far from the scaremongering of the right, I think you'd have to say that it's a typical American success story. It's a chain migration story. It's led by the success of American business, and as is true in many other areas of American urban life, it is often migrant populations, non-WASP migrant populations, who sustain urban life in the United States even after white flight has taken the white middle class and upper class out of the 19th and early 20th century urban centers.
So not a no-go zone, but just a normal American city. Just happens to be.
Well, I think a very unusual American city in that you've got excellent baklava and great Arab baking and a great coffee scene, no doubt, but a success story in that sense.
Well, it is always nice if an episode of this show comes full circle. So we're ending back in Lebanon in some ways in the form of Dearborn, Michigan. Unfortunately, we do need to end the show now, but as always, we'll be back in your feeds next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwoesPod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.